There is a moment in the history of every great empire when its power feels absolute and unshakable, when the cities are rich and full of scholars, when the merchants prosper beyond measure, when the armies stand ready at the borders, and nothing seems capable of shaking the foundations that generations have built. That moment can last for decades, sometimes for a century, but beneath the surface of that apparent permanence, quieter forces are always at work, pressures that build slowly, invisibly, and then all at once become impossible to ignore. Tonight, we tell the story of how such a moment ended, how the largest empire West Africa has ever known, an empire that seemed to its own people and to the wider world as fixed and eternal as the great river it was built upon, came apart in the space of 2 generations, undone first by the quarrels of its own princes, then by civil war, and finally by fire and gunpowder carried across the largest desert on earth. This is the second part of the story of Songhai. In our first journey together, we followed the rise, the slow gathering of a river people into a kingdom, the conquests of the sorcerer king Sunni Ali, and the long, luminous reign of Askia Muhammad the Great, the pilgrim emperor who turned conquest into order and order into a golden age, until his realm stretched across more than 1 million square kilometers, from the salt mines of the deep Sahara to the borders of the southern savannah, the largest empire in the history of West Africa. If you have not yet heard that story, this one will still stand on its own, and all you truly need to carry with you is a single image. Picture the empire at its height, in the early 1500s. The Niger River, the highway of everything, alive with fleets of canoes. The 3 great cities strung along it like beads on a cord. Gao, the capital seat of the emperor and his court. Timbuktu, the city of scholars and books, famous from Morocco to Mecca. And Djenné, the rich market of the south. Caravans of thousands of camels coming and going across the desert, salt moving south, gold moving north, and over it all a government of provinces and governors, judges and tax collectors, a standing army and a river fleet, all of it answering to one old, blind, formidable man in Gao, Askia Muhammad the Great, who had ruled for 35 years and made his empire the wonder of Africa. Hold that image of the empire whole, and now let time move again, because the fall of Songhai, when it came, did not arrive like a lightning strike out of a clear sky. It began with whispers in a palace, with the ambitions of impatient sons. It grew through 60 years in fits and starts, through coups and recoveries and one last deceptive summer of greatness. And it ended in a single afternoon on a cattle plain north of Gao, in the smoke of a weapon the empire had never faced, followed by a long twilight of occupation, resistance, and slow fragmentation. Every great collapse has a story, and this one deserves to be told slowly and calmly, the way the chronicles of Timbuktu themselves told it, by scholars who had lived through the ending and wrote it all down, so that the world would remember. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and come back with me to the royal palace at Gao in the month of August in the year 1528, where our story begins, at the very summit of the Golden Age, on the day the Golden Age began to end. Askia Muhammad the Great was, by that summer, a very old man. He had taken the throne as a seasoned general in 1493, and he had now ruled for 3.5 decades. The chroniclers reckoned him past 80 years of age. His eyes had failed him, a blindness that his closest servants had for years concealed from the court, and his grip on the daily business of the empire had passed, quietly and inevitably, into other hands. His beloved brother Umar, the great governor of the western provinces who had been the second pillar of the reign, was nearly a decade dead. Around the aging emperor, the palace had filled with faction and whisper, and at the center of the whispering stood his sons. Askia Muhammad had raised a very large family, dozens of sons by many wives, and he had done with them what dynasts of his age did everywhere. He had made them governors and generals, given them provinces and armies and titles, trained them from boyhood in the arts of command. It had been sound policy, and it had bound the empire together. But it also meant that as the old man faded, there stood around his throne a whole generation of ambitious, capable, battle-tested princes, each with troops at his back, each watching his brothers, and each asking himself the question that has undone so many empires: why him and not me? The eldest and boldest of them, Musa, answered the question first. In August of 1528, Askia Musa and his allies confronted their father and compelled him to abdicate. There was no great battle. The old emperor's power had simply completed its passage into younger hands, and the transfer was sealed by force of presence rather than force of arms. Askia Muhammad the Great, conqueror, pilgrim, lawgiver, caliph of the lands of the Sudan, laid down the throne he had held since before most of his subjects were born, and his son reigned in his place. The founder of the dynasty would live on for nearly 10 more years, blind and very old, kept at first about the palace, and later banished to an island in the Niger, until a gentler son at last brought him home to Gao, where he died in peace in 1538, and was laid to rest, tradition holds, in the great earthen tomb he had built. The old man's long dying casts a strange, sad light over everything that follows, because while he lived out those quiet years on his island, listening, we may imagine, to the fishermen's voices on the evening water, the empire he had built was already beginning around him to devour itself. For here was the flaw at the heart of the magnificent machine, the crack in the foundation that no one had repaired because in the good years no one had needed to. Songhai had laws for markets and weights, courts for disputes, offices for every branch of government, but it had never established a clear and accepted rule for the one transfer of power that mattered most, the succession to the throne itself. When an Askia died or fell, the crown went in practice to whichever prince could gather the most swords and the most great officers to his side in the critical hours. Askia Muhammad himself had taken the throne by exactly such a contest, and his sons had learned the lesson of his example better than the lessons of his laws, and the stakes of the contest had grown monstrous. A century of conquest and centralization had piled up wealth and authority at the imperial center on a scale no West African state had ever known. The treasury, the trade, the army, the appointments, all of it flowed from the throne. When the prize is a governorship, an ambitious man can lose gracefully and wait. When the prize is everything, men do not lose gracefully. That was the inheritance of 1528, hidden beneath the gold. The richest throne in Africa, and no peaceful way to pass it on. The reign of Askia Musa showed at once what the new age would be like. Having taken the throne by intimidating his father, Musa understood perfectly well that his brothers might do to him what he had done, and he set out to prevent it in the most direct way available. He began to kill them. The chronicles record the executions of prince after prince in those years. Brothers and nephews cut down on suspicion or on pretext, until the surviving sons of the great Askia understood that under Musa's rule, royal blood was not a protection but a death sentence. So they did what hunted men with armies do. They combined against him. In 1531, after only 3 years on the throne, Askia Musa was confronted by a coalition of his own kinsmen and killed, and the crown he had seized by force was seized from him by force in turn. Whatever rough justice there was in his ending, the damage of his example outlived him. In 3 short years, Musa had taught the ruling house of Songhai 2 fatal lessons: that the throne belonged to whoever dared take it, and that a reigning Askia and his rivals could not both safely stay alive. The princes did not this time crown one of the old emperor's sons. The throne passed instead to a nephew, Muhammad ben Khan, a son of the great governor Umar, an able and energetic man who reigned for 6 years and who spent them, in the manner of the age, campaigning at the frontiers and glorifying his court. The chronicles remember him for the splendor he added to royal ceremony, for orchestras and finery, and also for a harder act. It was Muhammad ben Khan who sent the old blind founder, Askia Muhammad, away from the palace at Go and out to the lonely island in the river, unwilling to reign under the silent judgment of the great man's presence. And it was that act, in part, that undid him, for the exiled emperor's remaining sons had not forgotten whose blood they carried. In 1537, while Ben Khan was away from the capital, a son of the old Askia named Ishmael seized the throne, and the 6th reign in 9 years began. Ishmael is remembered for one act of piety above all the rest of his short rule. He brought his father home. The old man came back from the island to live his final months in honor in Gao, and there is a tradition that the ancient founder, receiving the son who had restored him, girded Ishmael with his own sword and invested him with the caliphal honors he had brought back from Mecca 40 years before, the old age of the empire reaching out to bless what was left of its youth. Ishmael died of natural cause, in 1539, having reigned barely 2 years, and the crown passed to yet another son of the great Askia, Ishak, the first of that name. Askia Ishak the first reigned for 10 years, from 1539 to 1549, and his reign shows us what survival had come to require. Ishak was capable, and under him the empire held together and even prospered, but he ruled by fear, and the chronicles describe a court where no great officer could feel safe, where governors and commanders suspected of ambition were removed, exiled, or quietly destroyed before ambition could ripen into rebellion. It worked, in the way such methods work. Ishak died in his bed, an achievement none of his 3 predecessors had managed. But step back and count the cost of the generation. In the 21 years after the deposition of Askia Muhammad the Great, the empire had been ruled by 4 men. One was overthrown by his own family and killed. One was deposed in a coup. One died young. And through it all ran purges, executions, banishments, a steady bleeding away of experienced commanders and administrators, and a deeper wound that no chronicle could tabulate, the slow death of trust. Officials learned to serve the reign, not the state, and to keep one eye always on the next likely winner. The provinces learned that the centre's attention was consumed by its own quarrels. The army learned that its swords could make and unmake emperors. None of this destroyed the empire. The great machine of Askia Muhammad was strongly built, and it ground on collecting taxes, guarding caravans, holding the cities. But a machine can run a long time on the momentum of its builder, while the bolts work loose one by one, and no one who watched the throne of Songhai change hands in those years could honestly say the bolts were tight. It is worth pausing here to notice something that the drumbeat of coups can hide, because it explains why the empire survived this first crisis and why so many people inside it believed the danger had passed. Through all the palace bloodshed of the 1530s and 40s, the deep structures of the Songhai state held. The succession wars were fought at the top, among a few hundred princes, officers and courtiers. Below them, the enormous machine of the empire, the provincial governors and their staffs, the judges in the cities, the tax registers, the market inspectors, the garrisons, the river fleet, went on working because it had been built to work, and because the tens of thousands of ordinary officials and soldiers who ran it wanted, like functionaries everywhere and always, to keep their positions and their salaries regardless of which prince wore the crown that season. A farmer in the lake country or a fisherman below Gao might live through 3 coups without ever seeing a soldier. The flood came, the harvest came, the taxes were collected by the same local men as before, and the name proclaimed in the Friday prayers changed, and life went on. The caravans, those sensitive instruments, kept coming because the roads stayed guarded and the markets stayed fair. The scholars kept teaching. The gold kept moving. This resilience was real, and it was the genuine achievement of the founders, proof of how deeply Askia Muhammad had built. But it carried a hidden cost, which was complacency. Because the machine absorbed each crisis, the ruling house never had to pay the full price of its quarrels, and so it never learned from them. Each survived coup taught the princes not caution but confidence, the fatal lesson that the empire could withstand anything they did to each other. The provinces, meanwhile, were learning a quieter lesson of their own, that the centre's troubles were survivable, that its attention was divisible, that its wrath was negotiable, and that a governor who kept his head down and his options open would outlast any Askia. Loyalty was becoming a calculation. Nothing about that shows on a map, and the maps of 1545 show the same vast unbroken empire as the maps of 1525. But empires are held together by invisible things, and the invisible things were quietly wearing thin. And then, remarkably, the empire caught its breath. In 1549, on Ishaq's death, the throne passed, for once without catastrophe, to another son of the great Askia, Dawud, and with him began the last long summer of Songhai, a reign of 33 years that later generations would remember almost as a second golden age. Askia Dawud was the best of his remarkable generation, and he had been superbly prepared. For years before his accession, he had governed the great western provinces as Kurminafari, the second office of the empire, and he had already made his name as a soldier, for it was Dawud who in the 1540s had led Songhai's armies deep into the west and briefly occupied the capital of old Mali itself, the ancient rival humbled in its own heartland. As emperor, he showed all the gifts the empire had been starving for: energy without cruelty, firmness without paranoia, and a genuine cultivated love of learning. The chronicles, written by scholars, remember Dawud with unmistakable warmth. He was generous to the learned men of Timbuktu on a scale worthy of his father, endowing teachers and stom in figurera, students, and he was a man of books himself, maintaining libraries and employing secretaries and copyists at his court. A king who collected manuscripts as other kings collect trophies. Under his long rule, the wounds of the succession wars scabbed over, trade flowed at full flood, the cities flourished, the army campaigned successfully on the old frontiers, against the Mossi in the south, against rebels and raiders east and west, and the machinery of provinces and courts and markets turned steadily again. To live in Songhai in the 1560s or the 1570s was, for most of its millions of people, to live in a great power at peace with itself, and it would have taken an unusually gloomy observer to say that this empire had already, decades before, begun to die. The chronicles let us see Dawud's governance in enough detail to understand why his reign felt like a restoration. He attended to the unglamorous foundations. The traditions credit him with establishing granaries and provisioning stores along the river, royal reserves of grain that steadied the cities against bad flood years and fed the armies without stripping the villages, the kind of measure that wins no battles and prevents many. He kept the great offices filled with capable men, and learning from his brother Ishak's paranoia without repeating it, managed his overmighty relatives with a defter hand, promoting, rotating, honoring, and watching, so that ambition found outlets short of rebellion. The plots of his long reign, and there were some, were caught early and punished with a measured severity that frightened without inflaming. He campaigned regularly but purposefully, keeping the frontiers respected and the army employed, and he understood, as the wisest rulers of trading states always have, that his true weapon was prosperity. Safe roads, honest markets, and a full treasury made Songhai stronger. Every quiet year, while every year of war made someone else stronger, and he poured wealth into the faith and the learning that were the empire's glory. The scholars of Timbuktu, whose grandfathers had been endowed by Askia Muhammad, were endowed again by Dawud with gifts, lands, and pensions the chronicles itemize with satisfaction. He financed works on the great mosques, and in his own palace at Gao he kept, the sources tell us, a library and a staff of secretaries and copyists, an emperor who commissioned books in an age when most kings on any continent could not read them. Men remembered his court as magnificent, and his person as shrewd, pious, and long-headed, and the decades of his rule as good years, when the anxieties of the fathers faded into stories told to unworried children. If we could drift down one more time into a single evening of that Indian summer, somewhere along the river in the 1570s, we would find a world outwardly indistinguishable from the golden age we visited in our first story. The canoes ride home on the current, the salt caravan kneels groaning at the desert's edge, the market women count their cowries, the muezzin calls, and the old women pour milk for the older spirits, and no one quarrels about it. A griot tunes his lute and begins the deeds of the kings. And yet, if we listen closely in the dusk, the talk under the acacia trees has a new note in it that we would not have heard 50 years before. The elders can name in their own lifetimes 4 emperors who came to power over the body or the banishment of another. The merchants back from the North Country mention, between prices, that the Sultan's men in Morocco ask many questions about the roads, and that there was trouble at the salt mines in the old days that the young have not heard about. A retired soldier remembers aloud which prince he served against which other prince, and his neighbors laugh carefully. Nothing is wrong tonight on the river. The empire is strong. The harvest is in. The Askia in Gawe is wise and firm, and has reigned since before most of the village was born. It is only that everyone now knows, in the shrugging, weather-wise way, that farming people know things, that the peace they live in is a made thing, made and kept by one strong old man, and that strong old men do not last forever, and that no one, from the palace to this riverbank, has the faintest idea what happens after him. On that thought, which is where the whole empire quietly lived through the last years of Dawud, the evening closes and history resumes. Yet the far-sighted might have noticed two shadows at the edges of the sunlit picture. The first shadow lay within, and we have already traced its shape. Nothing whatever had been done about the succession. Dawud managed the problem as his father had, by filling the great offices of the empire with his own numerous sons, binding the realm together through his family. And in doing so he loaded with the best of intentions exactly the same weapon that had gone off in 1528. When he died, there would once again stand a crowd of governor princes around an empty throne, and everything would depend, once again, on how they behaved in the critical hours. The second shadow lay far to the north, beyond the desert, and it was new. In the middle years of the century, the sultans of Morocco, of the rising Saadi dynasty, had begun to look south with an attention that went beyond commerce. Morocco had always been the great customer at the far end of the caravan roads, but now it began to behave like a claimant. In the 1550s, a Moroccan force appeared out of the desert at Taghaza itself, the remote salt mines that were one of the deepest sources of Songhai's wealth, and though the raid did not hold the mines, a Songhai governor was killed, the miners were shaken, and a message had been sent that no one in Gao could entirely ignore. The lords of the north knew where the treasure lay, and they were measuring the road to it. Embassies and demands followed over the years, pressed and parried, softened at times with diplomatic gifts, for Dawud was too strong to be threatened and wise enough not to invite a war. But the ambition did not go away. It waited on the far side of the sands for the strength of Songhai to falter, and in 1582, after 33 years on the throne, Askia Dawud died, full of years and honor, the last ruler of Songhai who would ever die master of an undivided empire. The death of Dawud was like the removing of a keystone. For a third of a century, his personal authority had held the arch together, and men had allowed themselves to believe that the troubles of the 1530s had been an illness the empire had recovered from, rather than a condition it still carried. The years that followed stripped the illusion away. Dawud left behind him what his father had left, a crowd of adult sons in the great offices of the realm, each with wealth, troops, followers, and acclaim. The first to take the throne was Al-Hajj, so called because he had made the pilgrimage to Mecca, and he reigned for 4 uneasy years, years already thick with conspiracy. The chronicles record plots among the brothers almost from the first, including a rising organized around one of the great provincial commands that had to be broken and punished. In 1586, Al-Hajj, ailing and undermined, was deposed by his brothers, and the crown passed to another son of Dawud, Muhammad Bani, and with him the empire's luck ran out altogether. The chroniclers, who measured their words carefully, did not measure them for Muhammad Bani. They remembered him as unfit for the burden he had seized, a man of poor judgment and gross appetites, unequal to the office of his grandfather. Under his short reign, the quarrels of the princes hardened into faction, and the factions began at last to reach for their swords. Nature itself seemed to join the conspiracy against the empire in those years. The chronicles record that the early 1580s brought pestilence and hardship to the Niger lands, epidemic sickness moving through the crowded cities and hard seasons in the countryside, so that even as the princes quarreled, the ordinary foundations of the realm, the harvests, the markets, the health of the people were shaken by troubles no ruler could command. Historians reading between the chronicles' lines have suggested that the trade itself was already softening in these decades, the revenues thinning, the margins of the state narrowing, so that the political crisis fell upon an empire with less in reserve, less slack in the rope than it had possessed in the broad noon of Dawud's reign. It is one of the recurring patterns of history that great collapses are rarely single misfortunes. They are pile-ups, bad succession upon bad harvest upon bad luck, each one survivable alone, and it was Songhai's fate in the 1580s to draw them all at once. The blow, when it came from the west, and to understand it we must recall for a moment how the empire was put together. Songhai was, in a sense, two realms in one. There was the eastern heartland, the old Songhai country along the river around Gawar, the seat of the dynasty and the throne, and there was the great west, the provinces upriver, centered on Timbuktu and the lake country, and reaching toward the old lands of Mali, rich, populous, closer to the desert ports and the northern trade, and governed by the highest officers of the empire below the Askia himself. The men who held the great western commands, princes of the royal house nearly always, controlled armies of their own, and revenues of their own, and across the decades of succession struggle, they had learned to think of themselves as kingmakers and sometimes as kings in waiting. In 1588, the most powerful soldier of the West, the Balama Muhammad al-Saduk, a son of Dawud who held the great military command near Timbuktu, decided that the time for waiting was over. He raised the Western army in rebellion and began to march down the river toward Gao, gathering support as he came to take the throne from his incapable brother by force. He never had to fight Muhammad Bani. As the rebel army bore down upon Gao, the reigning Askia suddenly died in his camp, felled, the accounts suggest, by illness in the crushing heat as he prepared to meet the challenge, and the capital was thrown into a churning panic of intrigue, with the Western army approaching and no ruler on the throne. In the palace, a faction of courtiers conspired to crown a pliable candidate of their own choosing, but the plot leaked, and in the confusion, the eldest of Dawud's sons then present, Ishaq, moved faster than the conspirators, rallied his supporters, surrounded the plotters, and was proclaimed emperor in April of 1588, the second Askia to bear the name Ishaq. He had gained a throne. Now, within days of gaining it, he had to fight a civil war for it. The armies of East and West, the two halves of the Songhai state, met in battle, Songhai spear against Songhai spear, and Askia Ishaq II prevailed. The Balama's rebellion was broken, the pretender destroyed, and the emperor turned to the grim accounting that the age demanded, a great purge of the Western command. Officers who had marched with the rebel, or were suspected of wishing they had, were executed, dismissed, humiliated, or scattered. And loyal men, not always able men, were set in their places. Ishak II has come down to us curiously as one of the more likable men of his dynasty's bitter last chapter. The traditions describe him as personally brave, honest, and open-handed, well regarded by the common people of Gao. His misfortune was to inherit a state already cracked through, and then to be given no time at all. Consider what the civil war of 1588 had actually done beneath the surface of the emperor's victory. The unified imperial army, the instrument that had made Songhai unchallengeable for a century, had been set against itself and its western half. The shield of Timbuktu and the desert approaches had then been gutted by its own sovereign, its experienced commanders dead or disgraced, its ranks resentful, its loyalty a question no one could answer. The provinces had watched the royal house tear at itself for 6 years and had drawn their own conclusions. At the edges of the empire, subject peoples and tributary rulers quietly stopped paying, quietly stopped fearing, and began to test what they could get away with. The Tuareg pressed on the desert flanks. Revenues faltered as Africa stopped fearing and began to test what they could get away with. The Tuareg pressed on the desert flanks. Revenues faltered as commerce hesitated. The empire in 1589 still looked on any map like the Colossus of West Africa, its cities rich, its territory vast. But it was a colossus with a cracked spine, and its enemies, as we shall now see, knew it. For across the desert in Marrakesh, a man had been waiting years for exactly this news, and in that same year, out of the north, the news went to him. Let us cross the Sahara then, and meet him properly. Moulay Ahmad al-Mansur, Sultan of Morocco, of the Sharifian house of the Saadi, one of the most formidable and most calculating princes of the 16th century world. He had come to power in a single extraordinary day in 1578 at the battle remembered as Al-Qasr-Quibir, the Battle of the Three Kings, when a crusading Portuguese army led by the young King of Portugal in person had invaded Morocco and been annihilated. The Portuguese king died, the exiled Moroccan pretender he supported died, and the reigning Moroccan sultan, Ahmad's brother, died as well, in the very hour of triumph, so that Ahmad was proclaimed sultan on the battlefield itself, amid the greatest victory his dynasty ever won. The ransoms of the captured Portuguese nobility poured gold into his coffers, and the fame of the victory made him a figure honored across the Islamic world. He took the title Al-Mansur, the victorious. Yet the golden dawn of his reign concealed a persistent anxiety about money. Morocco stood squeezed between the two superpowers of its world, Habsburg Spain to the north and the Ottoman Empire to the east, and holding that dangerous independence required fortresses, fleets, artillery, and above all a large standing army of professional gunmen, expenses that ate revenue faster than Morocco's fields and customs houses could grow it. The defences of the realm strained the treasury even in victory. Al-Mansur was, moreover, a man of imperial imagination. He had begun to style himself caliph, a universal sovereign of Islam and a rival in dignity to the Ottoman Sultan himself, and such claims are expensive to sustain. He needed gold, permanently and on a great scale, and every educated man in Morocco knew where the gold of the world came from. It came up out of the desert, on the camels, from the lands of the blacks, from the empire of Songhai, which sat astride the golden roads, and grew rich on their tools. For years Al-Mansur studied that wealth the way a patient man studies a locked house. His predecessors had tested Tughaza in the 50s. He himself pressed demands and courtesies upon Askia Dawud, probing, measuring, learning the roads, receiving merchants and travelers who could tell him of the cities of the Niger, and finding Songhai, under Dawud, too strong and too self-assured to be bullied. So he waited, and in 1588 the house across the desert began, audibly, to crack. To understand the man Songhai was about to face, it helps to see the world he had built in Marrakesh, because Ahmad al-Mansur was no rough desert warlord. He was one of the most sophisticated rulers of his century, and his court was a marvel that visitors compared to any in Europe or the East. With the ransom gold of Al-Qasa Quebir he had begun, in the first year of his reign, a palace called El-Badi, the Incomparable, a vast complex of courts and pavilions and reflecting pools on which he lavished the treasure of the world, importing, the traditions say, marble from Italy, paid for weight against weight in Moroccan sugar, for sugar was the other pillar of his wealth. In the valleys of southern Morocco, the Sultan ran plantations and refineries, worked in great part by enslaved labor, whose sugar Europe bought greedily. He was a scholar king in his own right, learned in theology and mathematics, a calligrapher and a patron of poets, who conducted his diplomacy with a subtlety his rivals learned to fear. And his diplomacy reached far, squeezed between Habsburg Spain and the Ottoman Empire, each of which would gladly have swallowed Morocco. Al-Mansur balanced the two giants against each other and reached past them both to an improbable partner. Protestant England, Queen Elizabeth and the Sultan, sharing an enemy in Spain, built a discreet and busy relationship, exchanging ambassadors and, more to the point, goods of war. Morocco sent England the saltpeter that gunpowder is made of, and English ships brought back cannon, muskets, ammunition and timber, which is how it came to pass. Strange as it sounds, the guns of English manufacture would one day fire on the cavalry of Songhai on a cattle plain beyond the Sahara. All of this splendor and statecraft ran on money, and the money was never enough. The army of gunmen that kept Morocco independent, the fortresses, the fleets, the palace, the pensions, the sugar works themselves, consumed revenue relentlessly, and Al-Mansur's ministers lived in a permanent search for more. He tightened taxes until his subjects groaned, debased and reformed and squeezed, and still the ambitions outran the income. A man of that mind in that need with those weapons could look south across the desert at the golden roads of the Sudan and see only one thing, the answer. He prepared with characteristic patience and characteristic guile. Toward Gao he wore for years the face of a brother sovereign, sending embassies with courteous letters and princely gifts, condolences and congratulations at the successions, and the envoys who carried the gifts carried sharp eyes as well, noting the roads and the wells, the state of the army, the mood of the cities, the divisions of the princes. The merchants of the desert trade, who called it Marrakesh as they called it Timbuktu, were questioned and cultivated. By the late 1580s, Al-Mansur possessed what few conquerors in history have enjoyed, a detailed current intelligence picture of a target 1,000 miles away, and the picture showed him an empire tearing at itself. He had the means, the motive, and now, gathering year by year, the knowledge. What he still lacked was the occasion, and the occasion, as occasions do, obligingly arrived. At the salt mines of Taghaza, that remote and dismal treasure house in the deep desert, the Songhai state kept prisoners, and one of them, a man of the court, a rebellious kinsman of the Askia by some accounts, a royal servant by others, escaped his captivity and fled north across the sands to Morocco. Brought before the Sultan, he told al-Mansur exactly what al-Mansur most wanted to hear, that the great empire was broken within, its royal house divided, its western army purged and sullen, its ruler new and untried, and that a bold stroke from the north would find the colossus hollow. Encouraged, the Sultan dispatched a letter to Gao at the end of that year, courteously worded and utterly cold, demanding that the Askia concede to Morocco the revenues of Taghaza, in effect, tribute, dressed in the language of Islamic solidarity, with the Sultan casting himself as the defender of all Muslim lands against the Christian powers, whose protection deserved compensation. Askia Ishaq II returned the only answer a sovereign of his line could return, a flat, contemptuous refusal, delivered, tradition says, with a mocking gift of a spear and a pair of iron sandals, a message in the old symbolic language of the Sudan, that the Sultan could come and take his tribute with a spear in his hand when he had worn out iron shoes walking the distance. It was proud, and it was exactly what al-Mansur required. He now had his grievance, his invitation from a Songhai malcontent, and his moment. One obstacle remained, and it is to the honor of Morocco's scholars that it was raised at all. When al-Mansur laid his project before the great men and jurists of his court, many recoiled and said so. Songhai was a Muslim land, ruled by a Muslim sovereign, who honored the law and protected the pilgrims and the scholars, and the law of Islam did not permit war upon such a people for plunder. Nothing about the scheme was lawful, they argued, and much about it was mad besides, for no army in recorded memory had ever crossed the great desert to make war and survived. Al-Mansur heard them out, and then he answered them in a speech the historians of Morocco preserved, with the confidence of a man who has already decided. The Sudan, he told his councillors, was incomparably rich and incomparably vulnerable. Its ruler was no true caliph, whereas he, al-Mansur, Sharif of the line of the Prophet, had the better right. And the conquest of that golden land would strengthen all Islam, whereas wars against the armored powers of the north promised blood without profit. It would be easier, he is reported to have said, to conquer the Sudan than to hold a few frontier towns against the Turks, and far more profitable. The scholars had the law, but the Sultan had the state, and the state prevailed. The invasion of Songhai was decreed, and preparation began in careful secrecy for the most audacious military gamble of the age. To lead the expedition, al-Mansur reached past the great lords of his realm and chose a man who belonged entirely to him, a palace officer named Judar, thereafter Judar Pasha, and his story is one of the strangest in this whole strange history. Judar had been born far away in Christian Spain, in a village in the south of the peninsula, and as an infant or small child he had been carried off in a raid, taken to Morocco, castrated, and raised in the Sultan's palace as a eunuch of the court. He had grown up Moroccan and Muslim, risen through the palace service by ability and absolute loyalty, and by 1590 he was a trusted commander in the Sultan's establishment, blue-eyed, foreign-born, owing every scrap of his position to the master who now handed him the wildest commission of the century. We should be careful here to say only what the sources say. Judar was not some veteran of European wars. His whole career had been made inside Morocco. His qualifications were of a different kind: iron discipline, administrative competence, and a loyalty that had no family, no tribe, and no ambition outside the Sultan's service, which made him, in Al-Mansur's eyes, the perfect man to send 1,000 miles beyond the reach of supervision with an army and a treasure. The expertise in gunpowder that would decide everything lay not in the commander's biography, but in the army he was given. And that army deserves a careful look, because it was one of the most extraordinary forces ever assembled in Africa. It was not large. The fighting corps numbered only about 4,000 men, some 2,500 infantry, the greater part of them armed with the arquebus, the matchlock firearm of the age, alongside a body of about 1,500 light cavalry, spearmen and mounted gunmen, together with a siege train of 8 cannon, some of them, remarkably, guns of English manufacture, for Al-Mansur maintained a busy trade with the England of Queen Elizabeth, exchanging Moroccan saltpeter and sugar for English arms, and a bodyguard of renegade European soldiers about the Pasha's person. And its composition was as remarkable as its weapons. This was scarcely a Moroccan army at all, in the ethnic sense. Its officers and a great share of its gunmen were, like Judar himself, renegades and captives of European birth, converts from Christianity trained in the gunpowder warfare of the Mediterranean, and beside them marched Andalusians, Muslim exiles from conquered Spain, and their sons, who had brought the musketry of the Spanish wars with them into African exile, together with Moroccan spearmen and tribal contingents and mercenaries from farther east. Nearly every current of the violent 16th century Mediterranean had deposited something into this force. What bound it together was the drill. These were professional soldiers of the gunpowder age, trained to load and volley by ranks, to stand in formation under attack, to fight as a machine. Songhai had faced, in its century of empire, every kind of enemy its world could produce. It had never faced anything like this. Then there was the problem that had made the scholars call the whole scheme mad: the desert. Between Marrakesh and the Niger lay more than 2,000 kilometers of the harshest country on the planet, a crossing that hardened trading caravans, carrying nothing but goods and water, counted among the great ordeals of the earth. Al-Mansur's answer was organization on a scale the desert had never seen. The army marched with a transport train of 8,000 camels and 1,000 pack horses, tended by 1,000 grooms and drivers, with 600 laborers and engineers for the heavy work of camp and road, so that the whole expedition, soldiers and support together, moved as a travelling city of well over 10,000 souls, its route surveyed in advance, its water dumps planned, its guides hired from the desert tribes who knew every well. In the closing days of October of 1590, this extraordinary procession marched out of Marrakesh with the Sultan's blessing, crossed the Atlas Mountains, descended into the valley of the Draa, where the roads of the Sahara begin, and committed itself to the sands. The route had been chosen with care, and it tells us how thoroughly the desert had been studied. From Marrakesh, the army would cross the high Atlas Mountains by the southern passes and descend into the valley of the Draa, the long river of oases that runs along the desert's edge, the traditional mustering ground of the southern caravans, where the columns could water, reorganize, and take on the desert guides. From the Draa, the trail ran south by the wells the salt caravans used, stage by measured stage, to Tagaza itself, the halfway mark and the first objective, and from Tagaza on southward across the most dreaded stretch of the whole Sahara, the long waterless marches above the Niger bend to strike the river east of Timbuktu and march on Gao. It was deliberately the invaders' version of the road the salt had travelled for centuries. The caravan trade had mapped the desert for commerce, and now the map would serve for war. The golden roads turned against the empire they had built. The departure from Marrakesh in the closing days of October of 1590 was staged as the spectacle al-Mansur intended it to be. The Sultan reviewing the columns in their finery, the banners and the music, the long files of camels swaying out of the city gates, while the crowds watched an army march off the edge of the known world. The chroniclers of Morocco recorded the confidence of that hour. The soldiers themselves, veterans though they were, can have had no true idea what the next 4 months would ask of them. Men who have not crossed the great desert cannot imagine it, and most of those who marched out of Marrakesh that autumn would never see it again. The crossing took about 4.5 months, some 135 days, and it was every bit the ordeal the jurists had foretold. Day after day the column crawled south through the burning emptiness, from well to well, through country where the summer heat kills in hours and even the winter sun is an enemy, where the nights fall to a piercing cold, and where a single mist water source condemns men by the 100. The water was never enough, and often foul, and with foul water came dysentery, sweeping the camps. Thirst, exhaustion and sickness thinned the ranks week by week. Animals died in droves, and as the camels failed, loads were abandoned in the sand, and the margin of survival narrowed again. Men who fell too ill to march faced the arithmetic of the desert, which has no mercy in it. By the most common estimates, the expedition lost something approaching half its strength in the crossing. The graves and the bones strung out behind it along 1,000 miles of trail. That any of it survived at all is a testament to the grim discipline of Judar Pasha, who held the column together, kept the rationing exact, and drove the survivors forward on the only strategy the desert allows, which is that the way out is through. At the end of February of 1591, the vanguard of the army, gaunt, sun-blackened and reduced, saw at last on the horizon the green line of the Niger Valley, and knew that they had done what no army in memory had done. On the way down through the desert's final reaches, they had paused at Taghaza, the salt mines that had pretended to juice, stify the whole enterprise, seized them, plundered them, and wrecked the workings. The first act of the war, and a declaration of everything that was to come. Now perhaps 2,000 fit fighting men with their guns and their 8 cannon stood on the soil of the Songhai Empire, 1,000 miles from home, with no possibility of retreat. Ahead of them lay Gao, and gathering to meet them was the largest army in West Africa. The news of the Moroccan crossing had run ahead of the invaders, and in Gao, Askia Ishak II did what the emperors of Songhai had always done. He summoned the empire to war. The host that answered was, on paper, overwhelming. The chronicles differ on its numbers as chronicles do. The Tariq al-Fatash counts some 18,000 cavalry and nearly 10,000 infantry. Other accounts reckon 12 or 13,000 horse and 30,000 foot, and the highest traditions speak of far more. But on any counting, the Askia took the field with tens of thousands of men against an invader who could muster barely a tenth of that, and the mounted corps of his army was the celebrated cavalry of Songhai, heirs to 100 years of victory. Yet the numbers concealed the truth we already know. This was the army of after the Civil War, its western regiments purged and half rebuilt, its officer corps thinned by execution and suspicion, its cohesion papered over rather than restored, and in all its tens of thousands it possessed almost no firearms and no artillery whatsoever. For the gunpowder revolution that had remade war in the Mediterranean had not yet crossed the desert in any strength. Ishak chose his ground north of the capital, at a place called Tondibi, more fully Tankondibogo, a great cattle plain where his multitude and his horsemen would have room to work, and there, in the middle days of March, 1591, traditionally on the 13th of the month, the two armies met, and the fate of an empire was decided in an afternoon. The Askia's battle plan reached for the one weapon he possessed that the invaders did not: mass. In front of his host, his commanders assembled a herd of 1,000 cattle, intending to drive the beasts upon the Moroccan line as a living battering ram and a moving wall, behind whose dust and chaos the Songhai infantry would close to spear range, where their numbers must surely tell, while the great wings of cavalry swept in upon the flanks. Against any army West Africa had ever produced, it might have worked. Against a gunpowder army, it turned within minutes into catastrophe. As the herd rolled forward, the Moroccan ranks did what they had been drilled through 1,000 Mediterranean days to do. They stood, levelled their arquebuses, and fired by volley, and the cannon spoke with them. The cattle had never heard gunfire. The wall of sound and smoke and flame that erupted in their faces turned the herd in its tracks, and 1,000 panicked animals stampeded back the way they had come, straight through the advancing Songhai formations, trampling order into chaos before a single soldier had crossed spears. The Songhai infantry, with a courage the chronicles do not dispute, pressed the attack anyway, streaming through and around the wreck of the cattle charge into the open ground before the Moroccan line, and there they met the fact of the new age, rank upon rank of matchlock men, firing in rotation, volley after rolling volley, a continuous storm of lead delivered from beyond the reach of any spear or bow. Men fell in swaths. The cavalry charged in its turn. The pride of the empire and the horses, like the cattle, had never known the thunder and smoke of massed gunfire. The charges shattered against the volleys, broke, reformed, and broke again, and the survivors streamed away across the plain. By the accounts that have come down to us, the battle was brief, an hour, perhaps 2, of one-sided slaughter, and then the great host of Songhai was simply gone, dissolved into flight, all except the rearguard. The chronicles record that at the end, when the field was lost and the army in rout, a body of Songhai soldiers refused to run. They turned, stood, and met the advancing Moroccans hand to hand, and they fought where they stood until they were killed. Every man, the last soldiers of the old West Africa, dying on their feet in the smoke of the new. Askia Ishak II, watching his empire's army cease to exist in the space of a morning, took the counsel of his officers, turned his horse, and rode from the field to save what could be saved. Behind him, on the cattle plain of Tondibi, A century of Songhai supremacy lay dead in the grass, and the age of the gun had arrived in West Africa. The chronicles do not give us a trustworthy count of the dead of Tondibi, but they give us the shape of the grief. The slaughter did not end at the edge of the battlefield. It ended at the river. The broken army, streaming south with the Moroccan gunmen behind it, came up against the Niger, the ancient protector of the Songhai, and the protector became a trap. Fugitives by the hundred plunged into the water to escape, weighed down by arms and armor and panic, and the traditions remember that the river took its own terrible share of the army that day. Soldiers who had survived the volleys, drowning within sight of home. For weeks afterward, the news travelled outward along the waterways into every town and village of the empire, carried by survivors, each with the same impossible story. The imperial army was gone, destroyed in a morning by a force a tenth its size, by men who killed with smoke and thunder from beyond the reach of any spear. It is hard, at 5 centuries' distance, to feel the full strangeness and horror of that news for the people who received it. Songhai had not lost a great battle in living memory. Most of its subjects had never imagined it could. The world had ended between breakfast and midday, and no one on the river yet understood what world would replace it. What followed the battle was not the triumphant procession the victors expected, but the beginning of their education in the difference between winning a battle and taking a country. Askia Muhammad, retreating on the capital, made a decision that says much about him. Rather than let Gao be caught full of people by an army of plunderers, he ordered the city evacuated, its population and its portable wealth ferried across the river and dispersed into the countryside, and then he withdrew southeast with the remnants of his forces. So when Judar Pasha and his exhausted soldiers marched at last into the fabled capital of the Golden Empire, they entered a city half emptied, its treasures largely fled with its people, and the conqueror's first taste of victory was a bitter comedy of disappointment. The stories of the Sudan's wealth had grown in the telling all the way to Marrakesh, and Judar had crossed the worst desert on earth, expecting a city of gold. What he found was a great mud-built river town, imposing in extent but bare of the promised treasure. The Pasha's verdict has become one of the famous lines of the whole story. Surveying the palace of the Askias, the seat of the mightiest dynasty in African history, Judar is said to have written to his sultan that the house of the chief of the donkey drivers of Marrakesh was worth more than the palace of the emperor of Songhai. It was unjust as a judgment on Songhai, whose wealth had always lain in trade and cattle and people rather than in marble. But as a report on the prospects of the expedition, it was prophetic. Picture the scene of that entry, because few moments in African history hold so much meaning in so small a compass. Down the last miles of the desert road comes the conquering army, perhaps 2,000 fit men, ragged, sun-scorched, their uniforms rotted, half their comrades dead in the sand behind them, dragging their 8 precious cannon. And before them opens the capital of the greatest empire of Africa, the long riverfront crowded with abandoned canoes, the streets strangely quiet, the great earthen mass of the tomb of Askia Muhammad rising over the rooftops, exactly as it rises today, and the palace of the emperors standing open and echoing, its treasures gone east across the water with its people. The soldiers who had endured the Sahara on the promise of a city of gold wandered through courtyards of dried mud and found grain stores, cattle hides, salt, the working wealth of a working capital, and almost none of the glittering plunder of their dreams. Some treasure there was, enough for a first triumphant dispatch northward, but the overwhelming impression recorded in the letters and remembered in the histories was of anticlimax verging on betrayal, as if the desert had been crossed to burgle a farmhouse. The deeper truth which the disappointed conquerors grasped only slowly was that they had fundamentally misunderstood what kind of wealth they were seizing. Songhai's riches had never been a hoard. They were a flow, the endless moving stream of the trade, and a flow cannot be sacked. It can only be inherited intact by a ruler who keeps the peace that makes it move, or destroyed by one who does not. In the weeks after the fall of Gao, with the emperor fugitive, the roads at war, and the markets frozen in fear, the flow was already dying, and the conquerors stood in their empty palace like men who had killed the goose of the fable and were now searching its nest with growing bewilderment for the golden eggs. And Judar, standing in that empty palace with his sick and dwindling army, 1,000 miles from home, drew the sensible conclusion. When Askia sent envoys offering terms, and the terms were generous, a vast indemnity in gold, by the usual account 100,000 pieces, together with 1,000 slaves, if the Moroccans would simply go home, Judar was inclined to take the gold and declare victory. He forwarded the offer to Marrakesh, pulled his fever-ridden troops back from the unhealthy vicinity of Gao, and occupied Timbuktu instead in April of 1591, quartering his men on the resentful city while he waited for his master's answer. It came across the desert months later, and it was a thunderbolt. Al-Mansur had not beggared his treasury and buried half an army in the sand to be bought off with an indemnity. He wanted the country, the mines, the trade, the whole golden goose, and he read Judar's caution as weakness. The Sultan's answer was to strip Judar of supreme command and send out from Morocco a new commander with reinforcements, Mahmud ibn Zarqun, Mahmud Pasha, a harder man with harsher orders, who arrived in the summer of 1591 to finish the conquest by any means required. With him, the character of the war changed, from an invasion into something crueler. Mahmud Pasha struck fast. He marched the reinforced army downriver after the Askia, and in October of 1591, near Bamba, at a fight remembered as the Battle of Zanzan, he broke the reassembled Songhai forces a second time. The defeat finished Askia II. His prestige, staked twice and lost twice, collapsed. The army and the court, retreating into the southeastern province of Dendi, the ancient cradle country of the Songhai people, turned against him, deposed him, and cast him out. The end of this decent, unlucky man came swiftly and pitifully. Cast adrift with a handful of followers, he sought refuge across the river in the Gurma country, among peoples who owed his fallen house nothing, and there, within months, he was killed, by the Gurma by most accounts, by desert raiders, by others. His successor fared no better, and his fate showed the Sudan exactly what kind of enemy had come among them. The soldiers had raised up another son of Dawud, Muhammad Gao, as Askia, and to this new emperor Mahmud Pasha extended smooth words, recognition, friendship, an invitation to come and be honored, guarantees of safety solemnly given. Against the desperate warnings of his own advisers, Muhammad Gao chose to trust the invitation, perhaps seeing no other road that was not simply endless war. Some 40 days into his reign, he came with his notables to the Pasha's camp, was received with ceremony, and then, at the appointed moment, the trap was sprung. The last crowned Askia of the imperial line was seized at the reception given in his honor, and he and his companions were afterward put to death. Treachery had finished what gunpowder began. In less than a year from Tondibi, the Moroccans had beaten the imperial army twice, taken the 3 great cities, and destroyed 2 emperors, and it must have seemed in Marrakesh that the conquest was complete. It was not, and the reason it was not deserves to be remembered, because it is one of the great stubborn resistance stories of African history, and it is too often left out of the telling. Down in Dendi, in the river country of the far southeast where the Songhai story had begun 1,000 years before, the survivors of the army and the dynasty refused to submit. They raised up yet another son of the great Dawud, Askia Muhammad. And under his leadership, the remnant of Songhai did what beaten conventional powers have done in every age. They stopped offering battles and started offering war. For year after year, through the 1590s, Askia Muhammad and his fighters waged a relentless guerrilla resistance from the bush and the waterways of Dendi, ambushing columns, cutting supply lines, striking and vanishing into country they had known for centuries, and the invaders did not know at all. Mahmud Pasha marched into Dendi to crush them and learned what invaders of that country have always learned. The land itself fought for its people. This was no open desert-edge plain like Tondibi. It was a green labyrinth of river channels and thick bush where cannon were useless, where volleys had no targets, and where the diseases of the wet country, the fevers of the mosquito, and the sicknesses of the tsetse fly, against which the local people had generations of hardened resistance, and the northerners had none, killed Moroccan soldiers far faster than the enemy did. 2 years of campaigning in Dendi bled the occupation white and conquered nothing. The Pasha at last gave it up and turned back to, the cities, and the Askias of Dendi remained, unconquered, a rump Songhai kingdom in the southeast that kept the royal line, the title, and the defiance alive, and would keep them alive for generations, long after the Moroccan Empire in the Sudan had itself crumbled away. The empire had fallen, the dynasty diminished, never surrendered. The war in Dendi deserves a moment more of our attention, because it shows the other face of the military revolution, the face the conquerors preferred not to discuss. On the open plain at Tondibi, drill and gunpowder had been everything. In the bush and backwaters of Dendi, they were nearly nothing. Askia Muhammad's fighters refused every invitation to the kind of battle the muskets could win. They struck at dawn and at watering places, cut off stragglers and couriers, burned what the invaders needed, and melted away from what they defended, and let the country do the rest. The heat, the rains, the fevers, the sheer distances of a land with no roads the northerners knew. The Pasha's men built forts, and the forts became hospitals. Columns marched out strong and came back sick, thinner each season, and the arithmetic that had favored the invaders at Tondibi reversed itself utterly, for every Moroccan soldier lost in Dendi had cost a fortune to train, equip, and march across the Sahara, while the defenders were fighting at home, among their own people, in their father's country. Mahmud Pasha, the hard man sent to finish the conquest, spent years of his life and thousands of his men against that resistance and never broke it, and the war in the south finally consumed him too. At the end of the decade, campaigning in the rough country of the Hombori Hills, The conqueror of Timbuktu was caught in an ambush by the peoples he had come to subdue and killed, a musketeer's death in a spearman's country, far from Marrakesh and farther still from the golden triumph he had been promised. The men he had deported, the scholars in their Moroccan exile, permitted themselves, we may imagine, a certain grim reflection when the news arrived. By then, the occupation had already shown Timbuktu its character. When Judar's army first arrived in April of 1591, the city had submitted without a battle, hoping, as trading cities always hope, to buy safety with compliance and wait the storm out. What it received instead was the full weight of a stranded army's needs. The Moroccans decided to build themselves a fortress, a kasbah, in the heart of the city, and to make room for it they seized one of the wealthiest quarters, the district of the North African merchant community, expelling the householders and demolishing their homes for the stone and the space. Soldiers were quartered on the population, requisitions fell on the markets, and the proud city that had negotiated with emperors found itself governed by garrison order. The learned families watched, recorded, and seethed. The city's great Qadi, head of the very dynasty of scholars that had led Timbuktu for generations, met the occupiers with a cold, formal, immovable disapproval that the chronicles describe with relish, and his moral authority, which no musket could answer, became the quiet center of the city's resistance. Unrest flickered and was stamped out. Sickness thinned the garrison, for the Niger Valley was as unhealthy for the northern soldiers as the desert had been, and between the sullen city and its fevered garrison the relationship curdled, month by month, toward the explosion to come. Djenné, far to the southwest, had chosen even more pragmatically, submitting early and receiving its own garrison. The merchant republic within the marshes bent, as it had bent to conquerors before, and preserved itself, and its calculation in the terrible arithmetic of those years proved sound, for Djenné was spared the worst. Timbuktu would not be. Frustrated in the field, Mahmud Pasha turned his severity upon the one center of resistance he could reach, and in doing so committed the act for which the occupation is remembered with the most lasting bitterness, the breaking of Timbuktu. The city of scholars had never accepted its occupiers. Its jurists questioned the very legality of the conquest, as Morocco's own scholars once had. Its people rose against the garrison and were bloodily put down, and to the Pasha, the learned families, with their wealth, their prestige, and their quiet, corrosive disapproval, came to look like the heart of everything unsubdued. In October of 1593, Mahmud struck. On his orders, the scholars of Timbuktu were summoned and arrested en masse. Seized in the mosques and in their homes, a scuffle at the arrests became a pretext for killings, and the houses of the great learned families, the accumulated libraries and property of generations, were plundered by the soldiery. Then the Pasha did something crueler than plunder. The most eminent of the captive scholars, with their families, were chained, formed into a caravan, and deported, marched across the full breadth of the Sahara into exile in Morocco, the very desert road their ancestors' books had travelled southward down the centuries, now travelled north in fetters by the men who had studied them. Among the exiles was the most celebrated intellectual in West Africa, Ahmad Baba al-Timbuktu, then in his 30s, heir to generations of jurists of the Sankori tradition. He survived the terrible crossing, and in Marrakesh the conquerors discovered that they had imported a man they could neither silence nor answer. Scholars of Morocco crowded to study under the prisoner, and when Ahmad Baba was at last brought before the Sultan himself, tradition preserves the exchange in which the exile, unbowed, rebuked al-Mansur to his face for making war on Muslims, for sacking his city and looting his household, telling the conqueror of Songhai that of all his family's great library and his own portion, he lamented, had been the smallest among his kinsmen at some 1,600 volumes. The Sultan's soldiers had left him not one book. Al-Mansur had conquered the gold roads, the moral verdict of the learned world, pronounced in his own capital by his own prisoner. He could not conquer. Hold on to the name of Ahmad Baba as our story darkens. We will meet him once more before the end. And his road, unlike so many in this chapter, leads home. And what meanwhile of the golden windfall for which all this blood had been spent? Here the story turns on a bitter irony that Al-Mansur himself lived just long enough to taste. In the first years the plunder was real and it was spectacular. The wealth stripped from Gao and Timbuktu and Djenné, the confiscations from the merchants and the scholars, the seized stocks of the trade, all of it was packed onto caravans and sent north. And the arrival of those first great treasure convoys in Marrakesh became the sensation of the age. Foreign merchants resident in the city wrote home wide-eyed reports of caravans coming in from the Sudan laden with gold, and the Sultan, flush with the spoils, paid his armies in fine gold, adorned his marvelous new palace, and gloried in the title his subjects now gave him, Al-Dahabi, the Golden One. Seen from the palace of Marrakesh in the mid-1590s, the gamble looked won. But the caravans told a misleading story, because plunder is not revenue. What the conquest had seized was the accumulated treasure of a century of Songhai order. What it had destroyed in the very act of seizing it was the machine that produced the treasure. The gold of the Sudan had never lain in the Niger cities themselves. It came from far southern lands the invaders never reached and never even located, and it had flowed north only because a strong empire kept the roads safe, the markets fair, and the exchanges regular. That empire was now a battlefield. The merchants of the desert trade, the most sensitive instruments in Africa for measuring danger, felt the change instantly, and the flow of commerce shrank and shifted, some of it drying up, some of it bending away towards safer routes, and, ominously for everyone in the story, toward the European ships that now waited on the Atlantic coast. Taghaza itself, wrecked in the invasion, never fully recovered its output. The miners drifted to newer workings at Dendi. Within a decade, the stream of treasure reaching Marrakesh had thinned toward a trickle, while the cost of garrisoning a hostile country 1,000 miles across the desert ran on and on. Reinforcement after reinforcement, swallowed by the sands and the fevers, until clear-eyed men in Morocco began to murmur that the conquest of the Sudan was a wound disguised as a victory. When Ahmad al-Mansur died of the plague in 1603, his golden reputation intact, but his great project already souring, his sons fell instantly to fighting over his throne. Morocco slid into decades of civil war, and the distant province on the Niger, expensive, unprofitable, and unloved, began to be forgotten by the very power that had broken an empire to seize it. There is one more thread in the story of the vanished windfall, and it is almost a parable. Al-Mansur had invaded, at bottom, for the gold, and his commanders on the Niger were ordered, again and again, to find its source, to seize the mines themselves and make the flow of treasure permanent. They never found them. They could not find them because the mines were not there. The goldfields lay hundreds of miles farther south, beyond the reach of any army that had to be supplied across the Sahara. In forest country where the desert horses died and the muskets rusted, and their locations were, in any case, among the best-kept commercial secrets on earth, guarded for centuries by the mining peoples and the Wangara merchant families who alone knew the paths. Songhai itself, in all its imperial power, had never owned the mines. It had owned the peace along the roads and prospered by serving the trade rather than seizing it, a subtlety of statecraft that the conquerors grasped too late or not at all. When the soldiers came asking after the gold, the merchant network that had supplied it simply closed like water around a stone and rerouted itself patiently around the wreckage, some of it westward and southward toward the sea and the waiting European ships. The Moroccans had crossed the desert to capture a golden river and found themselves holding the empty riverbed. Meanwhile, the true costs ran on. Morocco fed the occupation with caravan after caravan of reinforcements across the years, thousands upon thousands of soldiers. By some Moroccan reckonings, more than 20,000 men sent south before the flow ceased, and of all those columns swallowed by the desert and the fevers and the endless small war, only a remnant ever saw home again. It has been suggested by historians of Morocco that the conquest of Songhai, celebrated as the dynasty's greatest triumph, was in cold accounting among the causes of its ruin, draining away in the Sudan the treasure and the veteran soldiers that the Saadi state would desperately need in the crises after Al-Mansur's death. If so, then Tondibi destroyed in the end both of the empires that met there, one quickly and one slowly, and the desert kept the accounts. Forgotten but not gone, and this is where the story of the occupiers takes its strange final turn. The soldiers of the conquest, the Pasha's men, could not simply go home. Most had no home to go to that was worth the crossing, and Morocco, absorbed in its own collapse, soon stopped sending pay, then stopped sending orders, and at last, within a generation of the conquest, around 1618, gave up appointing their commanders altogether. Stranded on the Niger, the army of occupation did the only thing it could do. It stayed, and it changed. The soldiers took wives among the Songhai, and Arma is what the country came to call them, and their descendants, a name drawn from the Arabic word for musketeers, Ar-Rumat, the riflemen, so that the occupiers were known forever after by the weapon that had won Tondibi. Within a generation or two, the Arma were no longer Moroccans in any real sense. They spoke Songhai. They were born of Songhai mothers. They knew Morocco only as a grandfather's story, and yet they held themselves apart and above, a hereditary military caste, proud of the muskets and the conquest, ruling the river cities from their garrisons, electing their own pashas at Timbuktu, and living off the taxes and tolls of the population around them. It was not much of a government. The pashalik of Timbuktu, as historians call this strange successor state, was chronically unstable, its soldiery deposing and raising pashas with numbing frequency. By one count, well over 100 of them inside a century and a half, some ruling for years, some for weeks, and its authority never reached far beyond the cities and the riverbanks that its muskets could actually see. Around and between the garrisons, the world the empire had once ordered arranged itself without permission. The Tuareg of the desert, whom Songhai at its height had held at arm's length, pressed back in upon the river, raiding, taxing, encroaching generation after generation, and the Arma, dwindling and quarrelsome, gave ground before them. In 1737, at the Battle of Toya, the Tuareg broke the Arma in open fight, and by the late 1700s the desert lords, Not the musketeers were the real masters of Timbuktu and the river bend. The last conquerors of Songhai had themselves been conquered, not by an army, but by the slow tide of the country they could dominate and never rule. And through all those generations down in the southeast, the other Songhai lived on. The kingdom of Dendi, the unconquered rump where Askia Nu had made his stand, settled after the war years into a long, stubborn afterlife as the heir and remnant of the empire. Its Askias, sons and grandsons and great-grandsons of the old imperial line, kept the title, the court offices, and the memory of Gao, ruling their river country from strongholds in what is now the borderland of Niger and Benin. And for decades they kept the war alive too, launching raids and campaigns northward against the Arma towns, seeking, in the way of exiled dynasties everywhere, the restoration that never came. It never came because it could not. The world that had made the empire possible, the unified trade, the intact Arma, the undivided house was gone. And Dendi itself, in the fullness of time, caught the family disease, quarrelling over its own successions, until, around the end of the 1700s, the last realm of the Askias divided peaceably into a scatter of small principalities, each ruled by a branch of the ancient line. It is a quiet ending, and in its way, a fitting one. The dynasty of Askia Muhammad the Great was never destroyed by its enemies, not by Morocco, not by the Arma, not by the Tuareg. It simply diminished over 2 long centuries at its own unhurried pace, and princes tracing their blood to the emperors of Songhai were still ruling villages on the Niger when the first European explorers came up the river to ask, in the name of a new age of empires, what had happened to the old one. Step back now and look at the whole land in the century after the fall, because the deepest consequences of Tondibi were larger than the fate of any garrison. What the Moroccan invasion destroyed, and what nothing afterward replaced, was unity itself. For the better part of 500 years since the rise of Old Ghana, the Western Sudan had known a succession of great ordering powers, each inheriting from the last the same essential work: one authority over the river and the roads, one peace over the markets, one law from the desert to the savannah. Songhai had been the third and greatest of those empires, and it proved to be the last. When it shattered, no successor rose. The pashalik held the cities but nothing more. Dendi held the old southeast. The Tuareg held the desert edge. The Fao, Ulani herding peoples, the Bambara along the upper river, whose new kingdoms at Segu would rise in the following century. The Mossi in the south, a mosaic of powers none supreme, each warring and trading and jostling with the rest, succeeded the single peace of the Askias. Old Mali, the shrunken ancestor, made one final gesture that closes its part in our 2 stories with a strange symmetry. In 1599, the reigning Mansa gathered his allies and marched on Djenné, the rich city his ancestors had failed to take and Songhai had taken, hoping to reclaim a place in the new order. The attack was beaten off, in part by the volleys of Arma muskets, and Mali, defeated by the new weapon just as Songhai had been, subsided back into its heartlands and faded. Over the following decades, but of imperial history altogether. The age of the great Western empires, the age that had begun before written memory with Ghana, ended in gunsmoke on the Niger, and what followed for 2 centuries was fragmentation. For the ordinary people of the river, The farmers and fishers and herders whose evenings we once imagined under the Songhai peace, the change arrived not as a date, but as a slow curdling of daily life. The roads grew dangerous, and the boats travelled armed. The taxes, once regular and predictable, became exactions, taken by whoever was strongest that season. The great annual rhythms of the trade thinned out. Caravans still came, salt still moved, but smaller, warier, costlier, and the wealth that trade had once spread through the river towns spread thinner every generation. And far away, on the ocean coast that the empire had barely thought about, the future was quietly rearranging itself. European ships, Portuguese first, then Dutch, and English and French, were drawing the commerce of West to Africa toward the sea, buying gold at the coast that once would have crossed the desert, and buying, in ever more terrible numbers as the new century wore on, human beings for the plantations of the Americas. The fall of Songhai did not cause the Atlantic slave trade, whose engines lay elsewhere, but the shattering of the region's great inland power, the ruin of the northward trade, and the endless small wars of the fragmented age all fed the catastrophe, multiplying the captives that the wars produced and stripping West Africa of any single authority that might have met the ships with one policy and one voice. Historians rightly caution against drawing the lines too simply, but it is fair and it is somber to say that the collapse at Tondibi helped turn the whole orientation of West Africa slowly from the desert to the ocean, from the old world of the caravans in which the region had dealt with the powers of the north as an equal for 800 years, toward the new Atlantic world, in which it would suffer as a victim for 300. Let us drift down one last time into a single evening, as we have done in every chapter of this long story, and see what the years have made of the world we knew. It is a night in Timbuktu, a generation after the conquest, sometime in the 1620s. The sun goes down red over the flat roofs, as it always has, and the heat loosens its grip, and the city sounds rise into the cooling air, thinner than they were in the great days, but alive. From the tower of the Jingwereba, a call to prayer goes out over the rooftops, as it has every evening for 300 years, and the city turns toward it. The Songhai townsfolk and the Arma soldiers alike, conquered and conqueror kneeling in the same direction, which is one of history's quieter ironies and mercies. In the Kasbah, the garrison's drums beat the evening watch. The soldiers on the walls speak Songhai now, with grandmother's words in it, and their pay is months behind, and their Pasha was elected by their own officers last spring, and may not last the year, and Morocco is a story their fathers told. In the market, trade goes on, smaller, warier, but going on. A caravan came in last month, and another is rumoured. The prices of salt are discussed with the old seriousness. In a courtyard in the scholars' quarter behind a plain mud wall, a lamp is burning late, and an old man is teaching law to a circle of boys from a manuscript that spent some years of its life sealed inside that very wall. And in another room of that house, though the boys do not know it, a man of the family is writing in careful secret Arabic a chronicle of everything that has happened, the kings, the golden age, the civil wars, the invasion, the terror, all of it, so that it will not be lost. Out beyond the city, the desert wind moves over the graves of two armies, and down at the river, the fishermen are bringing in the evening catch. Soko men whose ancestors fished this water before Gao had a king, and who will fish it long after the last Pasha is forgotten. because dynasties are weather on the great river, and the people and the water are the climate. The empire is gone, the world it was made of goes on. Hold that lamplit courtyard in your mind, and the scratch of the chronicler's pen, as we turn to what became of the learning of Timbuktu. The life of the mine, too, passed into its long twilight. Timbuktu, after the terror of 1593, was still a city of Islam and still a city of books, and it would be wrong and unfair to the stubborn families who kept the flame to say that its learning died. Teachers still taught, students still came, manuscripts were still copied in the courtyards for centuries more. But the golden conditions were gone, and everyone knew it. The great fortunes that had endowed the teaching were plundered or dispersed. The finest scholars of a generation had been killed, exiled, or scattered to safer towns. The far-flung students who had once crossed half of Africa to study at Sankore now went elsewhere, to Cairo, to Fez, to the rising schools of other regions, and the city that had been the intellectual capital of an empire dwindled decade by decade into a provincial center of a contested frontier, living increasingly on its memories. Yet here the story keeps, hidden in its sleeve, one of its few unqualified consolations, and it is worth pausing on, because we touched it in our first evening together. The books survived. Through the sack, the occupation, the anarchy of the pashalik, and every danger of the centuries since, the scholarly families of Timbuktu and the river towns hid their manuscripts, walled them up, buried them in chests, carried them into the desert, divided them among kin, and handed them down, generation after generation, as the one inheritance that mattered. Hundreds of thousands of those pages exist today, and among them, copied and recopied by candle life, art in the very decades of the catastrophe, were composed the two great chronicles, the Tariq al-Sudan and the Tariq al-Fatash, written in occupied Timbuktu in the 1600s by scholars who had grown up among eyewitnesses of the fall. Think of what that means. The definitive histories of the Songhai Empire, the sources on which every page of these 2 evenings has rested, were written under the rule of the empire's destroyers, by the grandsons of the persecuted, quietly, thoroughly, and without permission. The conquerors held the cities. The conquered wrote the history. In the long run, it is not always the musket that has the last word. Before we weigh the causes and close the account, let us pause once more, as we did in our first evening together, to name the witnesses, because the fall of Songhai is one of the best documented catastrophes in early African history, and the documentation itself is part of the story. From the Songhai side, our chief guide has been the Tariq al-Sudan of Abd al-Rahman al-Sadi, and it is worth knowing who he was. Born in Timbuktu in 1594, the year after the great deportation into the wounded scholarly world we have described, al-Sadi grew up among men and women who had lived the fall, served as an imam in Djenné, and as an official and diplomat in the administration of the pashalik itself, and in his later years set down, in measured Arabic, the whole history of the empire and its destruction, naming names, fixing dates, recording both the crimes of the conquerors he worked for and the failings of the emperors he mourned. Beside his book stands the Tariq al-Fatash tradition, the chronicle of Timbuktu's Kati family, which preserves among much else the counts of the armies at Tondibi. From the Moroccan side, we have the court historians of the Saadi dynasty, above all Al-Ifrani, who preserved the debates of Al-Mansur's council and the Sultan's own justifications, so that we can hear both empires reason in their own words. From Europe improbably come corroborating glimpses, an anonymous account of the conquest written by a Spaniard in Moroccan service, and the letters of English merchants resident in Marrakesh, one of whom recorded, with a trader's exactness, the arrival from Timbuktu of a caravan of 30 mules laden with gold, the plunder of the Sudan passing before Elizabethan eyes. We have the writings of Ahmad Baba himself, composed in exile and after. We have the oral traditions of the Songhai and the Arma and the Tuareg, and the archaeology of the cities and the manuscripts of Timbuktu. Chronicler and conqueror, exile and merchant spy, victor and vanquished. Rarely does the historian of any 16th century event on any continent get to hear so many sides of one story, and where their accounts differ on a date, a number, a motive, we have said so plainly tonight, for that honesty is what the scholars of Timbuktu would have demanded of anyone retelling their history. And so we come to the reckoning, the question that has hung over this whole quiet evening. Why did it fall? How does the mightiest state in the history of West Africa, a century old, vast, rich, sophisticated, and feared, come apart so utterly in the space of a single generation? The scholars who have studied Songhai, from the chroniclers of Timbuktu to the historians of our own day, point not to one cause but to a convergence. 3 great failures arriving together, each making the others fatal. The first failure was political, and it was the oldest, the succession. From 1528 onward, the empire never solved the problem of passing power peacefully, and each contested succession spent a little more of the state's inner capital, its trust, its cohesion, its store of experienced men, until the civil war of 1588 broke the army itself into halves and then purged the half that guarded the west. Songhai at Tondibi was not the Songhai of Askia the Great. It was that empire's estranged heirs, standing in the wreckage of their own quarrels. The second failure was economic and strategic. The empire's wealth was the wealth of a crossroads, dependent on peace, and the decades of instability had already begun to fray the trade, thin the revenues, and loosen the loyalty of the provinces. While far away the first European ships on the coast had begun, unnoticed, to bend the future away from the desert roads altogether. And the third failure was the one that supplied the executioner: technology. The gunpowder revolution had transformed war across Eurasia and the Mediterranean over the previous century, and the Sahara, which had protected Songhai from the armies of the north for its entire existence, had also insulated it from the new weapons. When the revolution finally crossed the sands, it arrived not as a warning but as an invasion. On. Even so, and this is the final essential point, the muskets alone need not have been the end. A united Songhai might have absorbed the blow of Tondibi, retreated, adapted, acquired the new weapons in time, as other states of the age did, and worn down an invader stranded at the far end of a 1,000-mile supply line. The unconquerable resistance of little Dendi shows what even a fragment of the empire could do. What made the catastrophe total was the meeting of the blow and the fracture. A gunpowder army striking, with perfect and partly accidental timing, an empire that had already broken its own spine. Great states are rarely murdered outright. They are murdered when they are already ill. It may soften the strangeness of Songhai's ending and place it where it truly belongs in the story of the world. to notice that the same drama was playing out in those very decades across the whole face of the earth. The 16th century was the great age of the gunpowder reckoning, when one proud old military civilization after another met the volley and the cannonade for the first time and was broken by them. In 1514, at Chaldiran, the Ottoman guns shattered the famous cavalry of Persia. 2 years later, the Ottomans turned on the Mamluks of Egypt, a warrior aristocracy 5 centuries old, among the finest horsemen who ever lived, and destroyed them in 2 battles. The Mamluks, like the knights of Songhai, had despised the new weapons as unworthy of brave men, and their valor made no difference at all. Across the ocean in those same years, tiny bands of Spanish soldiers with firearms and cannon brought down the empires of Mexico and Peru, powers as vast and confident in their worlds as Songhai was in its own. Tondibi in 1591 was Africa's entry in that terrible ledger, the same lesson delivered on a new continent, that courage, numbers, horsemanship, and a century of victories counted in the new age for less than drill and powder, and the lesson had a second half, which other states learned, and Songhai was never given time to learn. The new weapons could be acquired. Morocco itself had been on the receiving end of gunpowder armies before it built one. The Ottomans' victims became gunpowder powers in their turn. Within a generation, muskets were remaking armies from Japan to the Sahel, and the states that survived the century were simply those granted the time and the unity to adapt. Songhai, alone among the great powers of its day, faced the revolution with a broken government, a purged army, and an enemy arriving out of a desert that had hidden the future from it. It was not weaker or less capable than the empires that endured. It was unluckier in its timing, and in the end, in itself. Every empire in this long human story has fallen, and so the fall of Songhai in itself makes it not a failure, but a member of the most distinguished company history keeps, alongside Rome and Baghdad, and every other great power time has taken. What matters at the end is what it built and what survived. And when the smoke of the 1590s cleared, more survived than the conquerors ever understood. The Songhai people survived, and survive today, millions strong along the great river in Mali and Niger, still speaking the language of the empire, still fishing the waters the Sorco fished, still telling through their griots the epics of the sorcerer king and the pilgrim emperor. The dynasty survived in its diminished Dendi kingdom, where the line of the Askias ruled on for another 2 centuries, unbroken and unbowed, until the old realm faded away quietly around the end of the 1700s, having outlived the pashalik of its conquerors. The learning survived in the hidden libraries and in the great chronicles, waiting patiently for a world that would read them again. The monuments survived. The mud brick tomb of Askia Muhammad still stands over Gao, 5 centuries old and counting, still replastered by hand after the rains, and the mosques of Timbuktu and Djenné still lift their earthen towers over the river as they did when the empire was young. And the memory survived which may matter most of all, for through all the fragmented centuries that followed, and through the colonial age that came after, the peoples of West Africa never forgot that there had once been a time when the whole vast country from the desert to the forest lived under one law, when their cities were the wonder of the world, and when the greatest empire on the continent was theirs. Let us end then, not on the battlefield, but where we promised, on the road home. In the year 1603, the conqueror Ahmad al-Mansur died in his golden palace, and the iron began to loosen. Ahmad Baba, the great scholar of Timbuktu, who had been dragged across the desert in chains a decade before, and who had spent his exile teaching the scholars of Morocco and telling sultans the truth to their faces, was at last given leave to go home. In 1608, after 14 years of exile, he recrossed the Sahara, southward this time, and a free man, along the old caravan road, over the same sands that had swallowed armies, and came again to Timbuktu, to the city of his ancestors, wounded and diminished and still, defiantly, a city of books. There he lived out his remaining years among his students and what could be regathered of his library, writing and teaching to the end, and works from his hand survive to this day, and his name is remembered with such honor that the great Manuscript Institute in modern Timbuktu, the guardian of the very pages we have leaned upon all evening, bears the name of Ahmad Baba. The empire that raised him could not be restored, but the scholar came home, and the books came out of the walls, and the story, as you have heard tonight, was written down and kept. The Niger flows on past Gao in the darkness, as it flowed before the empires and flows after them, and on its banks the descendants of Songhai still tell of the greatness that was, and of how it ended, and of what endured. Every great collapse has a story to tell. This one is told. Sleep well.